We've got a fantastic panel. We've got guests joining us from all around the world. I won't introduce them one by one right now. I think everybody sees it in the bios in the package that you have in front of you. So let me first welcome Han Su-soo, IFF co-chairman and president of the 56th session of the UN General Assembly, as well as the former Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea. Prime Minister Han has a video message for us for this session, so if we could please play this video message. Thank you. Do we have the video message from Prime Minister Han? If we could play that, please.
Distinguished Chair, ladies and gentlemen, climate change is no longer a looming threat over the future, but a destructive reality that is already happening in the world. It is threatening all humanity on Earth, bringing about dire consequences regardless of developing or developed countries. It is encouraging to note that an increasing number of countries and companies are making a commitment to the Net Zero 2050 initiative. Last September, President Xi Jinping announced carbon neutrality for China by 2060. This announcement is truly a historical commitment that made the global target of Net Zero 2050 an irreversible goal for all of us. The international community has paid growing attention to the climate change issues since the 1990s by formulating and adopting various strategies, conventions, and treaties. Today, however, I would like to draw your attention to potential significant risks related to those efforts which we might otherwise easily overlook. That is, we might have been simply too obsessed with formulating and joining international treaties with too much ambitious goals and targets that have never been fully realized. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, adopted in 1992, stipulated that developed country parties should reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to the levels of 1990 by the year 2000. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997 and ratified in 2005, concluding that parties should reduce their emissions by 5.2% by 2012. The Doha Amendment to Kyoto Protocol, which adopted in 2012, furthered the required level of reduction by at least 18% below 1990 levels by the year 2020. The Code, adopted in 2009, agreed a goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion per year by 2020 and invited more than 100 countries to submit pledges for ambitious targets and actions to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, all these targets and goals to limit the greenhouse gas emissions could not deliver emission reductions they were supposed to deliver. Setting up an ambitious target for the next 10 to 30 years does never guarantee that the desirable outcomes will be achieved. To reach the targets we have set and make real changes, we must take real actions. Now it is a time that we need to stop repeating the same mistake of fooling ourselves just by announcing ambitious targets, but implementing immediate and meaningful actions to curb the climate change. In this light, I'd like to welcome the United States' return to the Paris Climate Agreement, a landmark accord in the progress of international cooperation and multilateral governance on climate change. The Paris Agreement, based on NDC, nationally determined contributions, provides only a voluntary mechanism for pledge and review. The success and failure of the agreement again depends on implementing and executing our actual policies and actions, not on making our pledges on targets for the future. Our actions to tackle climate change, unfortunately, have taken a backseat to the pressing issues of COVID-19 has presented. Now it appears that the efforts are concentrated on addressing social and health issues and reviving the economies which have been severely disrupted by COVID-19 crisis. The challenges before us are unprecedented. Historically, economic policies mainly focused on stimulating economic growth while controlling inflation and unemployment. This time, however, we have to revitalize the economy while managing massive social crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also need to pursue a dramatic decarbonization of our industrial economy at the same time. We never experienced a challenge similar to what we are facing now. We have to revive economic growth while managing the massive social crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as pushing for dramatic decarbonization of our industry and economy. The challenge we are facing now is in fact a challenge whether we could ever operationalize the concept of sustainable development. Idea of sustainable development was adopted in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The international community unanimously welcomed the idea of enhancing economic growth while protecting the environment as well as promoting social development. Despite our commitments and endeavors, climate crisis has been exacerbated. Social disparities have been widened and income and wealth inequalities have been aggravated. The COVID-19 pandemic and climate crisis are wake-up calls that we do not have more time to spend in formulating strategies and setting goals as we did the past 3 decades, but we have to initiate immediate and practical actions to operationalize the concept of sustainable development. Although we are very well aware of the needs for increasing investment in climate actions, we are still hesitant to decarbonizing our energy and industry, believing that it might damage our economy and it might lead to job losses. It is a sheer manifestation that understanding of the sustainable development as well as interactions among economy, social and environmental development still remain rudimentary and not well established. We can no longer remain timid and hesitant in balancing and integrating the 3 pillars. Now is the time to realize the sustainable development by maximizing the synergy while minimizing negative trade-offs among the 3 pillars of sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, while I was serving as Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea during 2008 and 2009, I have pioneered and operationalized the concept of green growth, the idea of stimulating economic growth by investing in climate actions. I firmly believe that investment climate action is not a burden or cost which hampers economy, but a driver and enabler of economic growth and job creation. During my service as chair of the OECD Ministerial Council meeting in 2009, I garnered the unanimous support from the participating minister delegates to pass a resolution on green growth on June 25, 2009. Based on this resolution, the OECD carried out a 2-year study of green growth and produced a monumental document towards green growth on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the OECD in 2011. The concept of green growth is to synergize the 2 pillars of the sustainable development, economy and the environment. However, synergizing 2 pillars of sustainable development is not enough. We have to integrate social pillar as well. The COVID-19 pandemic made us realize that an outbreak of a virus can shatter our society and economy into pieces within a very short span of time. Deep decarbonization of industry and transformation of energy system towards renewable energy should be viewed as an opportunity towards green economic growth and job creation, as increasing investment in public health system and social protection scheme is regarded as a function found dealing with the current challenges and building back better from the COVID-19 crisis. Although we understand the need for investing decarbonization and public health for green economic growth, we are still finding the best way to operationalize the concept into real actions. Previous theories and knowledge can offer a very limited insight on how we can integrate these three pillars of sustainable development for maximum synergistic result. This is why we have to pool our wisdom and share best practices through international cooperation. Unprecedented challenges such as climate change crisis and COVID-19 pandemic calls for even stronger international collaboration and partnership. Carbon neutrality is not a matter of energy transformation. The net zero 2050 requires a drastic departure from a traditional economic system, whether the price of carbon emissions was neither considered nor paid. We have to rebuild our economy and industry by taking into account of the price of carbon we are emitting. Carbon neutrality requires innovation in energy technologies and industrial policies. Among others, carbon pricing should be introduced in our energy market, industrial restricting and tax reform. We can no longer depend on conventional approach of exploiting cheap fossil fuel without paying the price of carbon for rapid economic development. Investment in renewable energy and transformation for decarbonization is a driver of achieving green and sustainable economic growth. The paradigm shift toward green recovery based on renewable energy and deep decarbonization has to be pushed by concerted and collective actions among major economies of the world. Peer pressures and collaboration among major economies will lead on climate change as they correct the market distortions caused by fossil fuel exploitation and thus construct more favorable conditions for carbon neutral future. Collaboration among major economies for green recovery and decarbonization is necessary but not sufficient. Substantial support for many developing countries, lack of capacity for energy transformation and green recovery is essential. It has to be effectively institutionalized through the Green Climate Fund and Paris Climate Agreement. Many important issues have to be extensively addressed and agreed at the upcoming COP26 Glasgow to be held in November this year. The UK, the host country, has an ambitious goal of accelerating actions for mitigation of carbon emissions and scaling up of financial support for developing countries. We have spent enough time since 1992 when the UNFCCC was first signed and learned enough that setting ambitious targets and delivering real climate actions to reduce emissions are two different things. In this regard, I sincerely hope that the COP26 does not repeat the same mistake of confusing the enhanced NDC targets with the real climate actions. I have seen too many COPs wasted by simply being obsessed on haggling over the target numbers, but missing the core issues such as carbon pricing, the fiscal reform for decarbonization and mitigation. It is very important that the Glasgow COP will act as a platform to implement real actions for decarbonization and to deploy concerted global actions for mitigating carbon emissions, as well as to provide financing support to developing countries in climate actions. Thank you for your attention.
Great, and thank you to Prime Minister Han for that message. I think really giving us a renewed sense of urgency in terms of really having to come together to tackle this problem. At least the message that I got from Prime Minister Han right now is not enough is being done. We've done much, but not enough is being done, and we need to speed up our process. So thank you for that, Prime Minister Han. Our next panelist joins us online is Laurent Fabius. He is an IFF board member and the former Prime Minister of France and President of the Constitutional Council of the French Republic. So, Laurent, if you can hear me, you're up next. So we would very welcome your remarks on how we can boost international cooperation.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. So maybe if you want to follow up on what you heard from Prime Minister Han's message and then add your own thoughts to this as well.
Yeah, well, I agree with what our friend Prime Minister has said, and particularly on the necessity of urgent action. Well, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues and friends, it's a pleasure for me to participate to this spring meeting. I will present 3 short comments on the green recovery of global economy in what is called the post-pandemic era. My first comment is that due to the profound and various consequences of COVID-19, recovery plans are an absolute necessity, but, and I insist on but, they reach different levels from one country and one region to another. We know that in rich countries, recovery plans amount to a total of $12 trillion, which represent around 12% of global GDP. The IMF forecasts that the effects of the pandemic for rich countries will be rather limited in the near future, provided, obviously, that the pandemic does not start again. And IMF tells us that compared to the 2008 financial crisis, where the losses reached 10% 5 years later, with this current pandemic, these effects will probably be only 1% on advanced economies. And even in some countries, for instance, the US, the economic situation after the crisis may be even better than before. But, meanwhile, many developing countries are being left behind. They suffer from significant setbacks on their development path because of rising debts and of their limited ability to inject liquidity in their economies. Therefore, the poorest ones risk to be affected by more severe damages from the pandemic than what they did after the global financial crisis. And the conclusion is clear, and it is my first comment. Through various channels, supporting developing countries in their recovery is crucial. We will only get out of the crisis if we demonstrate solidarity and mutual support, particularly through finance, technology, and health programs. That's my first comment. My second comment is that, unfortunately, the actual green part of the so-called green recovery is often not sufficient. According to UNEP, a green recovery could reduce emissions by 25% in 2030, which could lead to limiting warming to below 2 degrees by the end of this century. In the current context of the climate emergency, and because the recovery funds cannot be spent twice, it is essential to be ambitiously green. And I insist on this formula, ambitiously green. Most recent forecasts from UN confirm the speed of climate warming. And very recently, tells us that there are now 40% of risk that average worldwide temperature will overcome before 2026 the 1.5 degree limit, while our common objective and commitment set by the Paris Agreement is to stay under this limit till the end of this century. 2026 on the one hand, the end of the century on the other hand. And it means a genuine red alert. So far, the goal of a green recovery, let's be honest, has been largely missed. Among G20 members, only a quarter, including France, the UK, Germany, and South Korea, have devoted a significant part of their spending to green transition measures. It is not too late to adopt significant green policies and programs, but it is necessary and urgent. It is my second comment. My third comment is that we need then to increase and accelerate our efforts. States are setting long-term goals, okay, that's good, but ambition action needs to be taken right now. Recent reports are clear. If we continue on our current trajectory, we risk a warming of 3 or 4 degrees by the end of the century, and maybe more. The risk is real to miss the Paris goals. We know the solutions to avoid this. According particularly to a recent report of the IEA, International Energy Agency, this would require an unprecedented transformation of the production of energy. Therefore, it's an overall shift in our mode of development. In the coming months, we shall have the G7 and G20 meetings, and we shall have 2 major events which will take place on the first on climate change, COP26 in Glasgow, and also the important COP15 in Kunming on biological diversity. Among the important points of discussion, finance, national commitments, innovation, just condition, there is also, and I would like to stress that element, the opportunity to discuss the complex and important issue of carbon pricing. I personally believe that putting a price on carbon emissions is essential. But I want to draw your attention that at present there is no common approach on the difficult question of carbon border mechanism. And I want all of us to pay attention not to spoil the necessary multilateral discussions about this important topic by unilateral decisions, and I want to insist on the possible fruitful approach in that domain, sector by sector, cement, steel, and so on and so forth. I insist on that point because I am, as the former chairman of COP21 and Paris Agreement, in contact with the various countries, and in particular with China, with US, and with the European countries. And I see a risk, and I insist on this, that if unilateral decisions are taken in this very tricky question of carbon pricing and carbon border mechanism, the whole agreement can be difficult to achieve. Today, I remember that in 2015, when preparing Paris Agreement, the triangle EU, China, US was key for success of the agreement. And it is crystal clear that we need once more to work together, all the countries, and especially this triangle, if we want, despite differences, to reach the necessary agreement. In short, this same triangle could encourage the political will of all countries. Today, let's be clear, we listen to many long-term announcements for 2050, 2060 by many governments, and there are important steps which are taken in the approach of corporations and financial actors towards climate change, and all this is very positive in the perspective of a low-carbon society. Okay, but we remain far from the necessary short-term decisions in line with this long-term goal. The risk in focusing on the destination is to ignore the pathway. We need long-term approach, but we need short-term decisions. And we must reconcile the two horizons and act quickly and strongly in an internationally coordinated effort. It is the challenge of COP26 in Glasgow to implement really the Paris Agreement. Therefore, the two key words are action and urgency. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Laurent. Action and implementation definitely necessary, and I loved your point about supporting developing economies. That will be absolutely crucial. I guess, I think especially when it comes to advanced economies, perhaps can we actually see a transfer of green technologies to support developing economies and making that transition as well? Enjoyed that point about avoiding unilateral decisions on carbon pricing and the risk of just focusing on the destination. We have to have our short-term plans and policy goals really fit in with our long-term goals as well. And after hearing all of that, Inger, I feel like you just have an extremely difficult job ahead of you. Inger Andersen, Undersecretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, joins us now. So Inger, over to you, because recently we also did hear from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, reiterating that we are really just not on track in terms of meeting the Paris Agreement. So after everything that you've heard so far, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I have to really salute both Han Song-soo, former Prime Minister, as well as Laurent Fabius for absolutely outstanding speeches. And it is about the urgency, and just having listened to Laurent, if I may, it's a little bit like we're making these promises, like the marathon runner who says on January 1, I'm gonna run a marathon in December, but then doesn't train for it. If we don't take the actions, we won't make the destination. It's that, and I think that what we heard from Mr. Fabius was precisely spot on. Because, and if we look at this in the context of the COVID-19 global tragedy of this pandemic, which we have to overcome for everyone's safety, of course, we have to think about this as not as a one-off event or even as the biggest threat that we are facing. I often say that the pandemic is just a little overture to what is to come if we do not heed these warnings that the planet has been sending us, and if we do not make a transformation of our economies and societies. And as Han Song-soo said, making the commitments is easy, it's following through. And in the simplest possible terms, that means therefore taking real, meaningful action to stabilize the climate, to protect our natural world and biodiversity, and to stop pollution. And if we don't do this, we can essentially say goodbye to any chance of a world in prosperity, equality, and peace. And if we listen to what everyone is saying, it seems that this message has been received out there in the media, has been received by politicians across the world. There's a wide agreement that COVID-19 recovery spending, that money we're putting into our economies to accelerate action, that this should accelerate the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, all these other critical agendas. And lots of research out there, including from UNEP's Emissions Gap Report, backs this up, showing that, and in fact, Mr. Fabius referenced it, that a green COVID-19 recovery can knock off this 25% of emissions by 2030. So there's wide agreement that the most effective stimulus policy are those that create recovery through decarbonization. We heard that from the former Prime Minister, and that tackling nature and tackling pollution can be another benefit. And there's wide agreement that these policies can also address inequality and improve health, etc. But we are not building back better. Look, as we've seen some of the recovery money, we have seen some recovery money flowing into the right places. And just a couple of examples. Spain took 10 billion into green infrastructure. That's great. China has invested has created a fund for environmental protection, energy efficiency, green transport. India put 817 million into afforestation. And there are examples. I speak to you from Nairobi, Kenya, and we have examples here too. But the truth is that the global spending so far has not matched the severity of these planetary crises, the climate crisis, the biodiversity and nature crisis, and the pollution and health and waste crisis. And so it leaves behind significant social and long-term economic benefits that we have not captured. And that's a great shame. Together with the Oxford University, the IMF, UNDP and GIZ, UNEP looked at about 3,500 policies in 50 major economies in 2020 that were instituted as a response to the pandemic. And it showed that only 18% of recovery spending and 2.5% of total spending had a positive green characteristics. So investments in nature were disappointingly small, with just over 3% of the spend. So basically, many of the big developed countries, those economies in the G20 that are responsible for the vast, over 70% of carbon emissions, are not using these monies that they are taking from the future generation, borrowing from the future, putting into the economy, but they're not using these monies wisely for that next generation to live on a stable world. In fact, we're using it to return to the old polluting ways. So we need to do better, which means from our perspective in UNEP, there are 5 priorities that we need to tackle right now. And the first is clean and efficient energy. Today, hundreds of millions of people struggle with energy poverty. We have to provide energy equity and connectivity for these people. This is clear. We promised that in the Sustainable Development Goals. But we have to, at the same time, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that means solidarity, as we heard from Mr. Fabius, prioritizing clean, renewable energy, moving away from coal, no new coal investments at all. We are calling for the fossil fuel subsidies, along with concerted efforts to improve energy efficiency. If we do this, we can also reduce poverty and the health burden of air pollution, help education and livelihoods, and many, many other social benefits that we all understand. So, clean energy. Second, clean transport. The transport sector contributes almost a quarter of energy-related CO2 emissions. So it's a big area that we need to hit. And we need to promote electric and hybrid vehicles, collective transport, public transport, through increased incentives and tax breaks. Now, we saw that in Poland just like last year, which put 178 million to electric vehicles. And we've seen this across the world. We saw it in Chile, which invested in expanding its electric bus fleet, etc. And we are seeing the same thing happen, for example, in Germany and France, where aviation sector was supported, but they had to replace short-haul domestic flights with rail. So transport, getting it clean right now. The third sector that we need to hit right now is green buildings. As I've said earlier, energy efficiency has to be prioritized alongside that shift to clean energy. Material efficiency is just as important, given how much resources we are using to extract from the earth, create those raw materials that we need for our buildings. If we green the construction sector, if we begin to think circular and build green buildings, we can hit both targets while boosting jobs, improving living and working conditions. According to the IEA, every 1 million invested in retrofits of efficiency in older building measures in new builds create about between 9 and 30 new jobs. And the fourth area of priority that we need to focus on right now is natural capital, nature-based solutions, such as ecosystem restoration or green or hybrid infrastructure, are critical to fighting climate change and restoring our biodiversity. Just to give you an example, nature-based solutions can help provide over 1/3 of the annual mitigation required by 2030 to keep global warming to under 2 degrees. That doesn't mean that we don't decarbonize our economies. We must, but that will take some time. So let's have nature on our side so it can help buy down those emissions. And at the same time, we get that return to biodiversity. On the 5th of June, we will be launching the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and we'll really have a chance to pick up the speed on that restoration. And the 5th area that I want to highlight is research and development. If we are to make our societies and our economies clean, lean, and green, we need to innovate. Investments in green research and development stood at 28 billion in 2020. And such investment can be instrumental in supporting innovative technologies and solutions. For example, on circularity, on sustainable agriculture, on cleaner infrastructure and other areas. Here, a couple of examples: Germany and South Korea have shown commitment in this area, investing in recovery funds on hydrogen, on industrial decarbonization and green manufacturing. But all of this has to come with a clear package of solidarity and of access to finance and technology. Because we have to be in mind that this conversation does not just stop at the spending policy. Research by Ed Barbier and UNEP indicates that one of the key lessons, and we heard that from Mr. Fabius, from the Great Recession, is that spending and stimulus efforts need to be followed by reforms that address key market failures and pricing externalities. And this means accounting for the value of nature, the damage our economy and our economic activities are causing to it, and that has to be incorporated into all of our decisions. And then there is that dimension of solidarity. Advanced economies are now working on their recovery policies, and they have amassed the vaccines for their population. Where I'm sitting, less than 1% of the population has been vaccinated, with no hope of being able to purchase vaccines on the global market. So we need to support developing nations on everything, from climate resilience to supply chain circularity to access to vaccines and technology. In particular, developing nations may see high benefits from natural capital investments. Many natural capital projects, including restoration and afforestation, do not require very complex settings or highly skilled labor or even a lot of funding, and they could provide some income to the most vulnerable communities right now at an expeditious speed. But also we need to talk about extending debt service suspension initiative and expanding the common debt framework, including all lenders, be they multilateral or bilateral, and issuing more special drawing rights and debt restructuring. All of this is key to these short-term solutions that will need to be complemented by greater international collaboration so that we scale up green finance, green fiscal policy solution into the longer term. But as with COVID-19, a sustainable global recovery from climate change, from biodiversity loss, and from pollution and waste is not possible unless everyone recovers. If one person has COVID, we all have COVID. If one person has climate change, we all have climate change. So friends, pandemic recovery spending, despite the slow start, still remains that major opportunity to kickstart an accelerated action that we need to create that peaceful and prosperous world that lives in harmony with nature. We can't afford to miss this one. Thank you.
All right. Round of applause for that. Very fantastic message. Thank you for that, Inger. Again, just to recap the 5 priorities of UNEP right now: clean energy, clean transport, green buildings, natural capital, nature-based solutions, very important. We often talk about green technologies, but nature-based solutions are very important as well, and research and development. So thank you for that, Inger. All right, let's welcome our next panelist now. He is Kazuhiko Takeuchi, President of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies and Chair of the Central Environmental Council of the government of Japan, Mr. Takeuchi has also a video message for us, so let's listen in.
Hello, my name is Kazuhiko Takeuchi, and I am president of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, or IGES. It is my pleasure today to speak to you about investing in a green recovery from COVID-19 for a sustainable future. This is a critical year for global sustainability and the start of a decisive decade for action. The world has 10 years left to implement the 2030 Agenda and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Meanwhile, governments are raising their climate ambition. On the road to COP26 in Glasgow, more and more countries have been committing to net zero emissions by around mid-century. Many countries have also significantly strengthened their 2030 reduction target. At the same time, countries are also gearing up to negotiate the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at CBD COP15 in Kunming. The world is expected to come together to work towards no net loss of biodiversity by 2030 and 20% net gain by 2050. We understand now that simply returning to normal after COVID is not enough. It is important to redesign our socioeconomic systems and employ a long-term perspective for long-term prosperity. At the International Finance Forum held in November last year, I introduced the RRR framework for recovering better, whose main components are response, recovery, and redesign. To redesign our societies, it is critical that we prioritize restoring and maintaining planetary health. A healthy planet allows for healthy people. To redesign our societies, we must live within planetary boundaries. To redesign our societies, we must go beyond silos. We need to take an integrated approach to addressing the various global challenges we face. Such an integrated approach will allow us to strengthen the linkages between global, social, and human systems. It goes without saying that to redesign our societies, we need transformative action on climate. Prime Minister Suga of my country, Japan, announced in October last year that the country will commit to net zero emission by 2050. Following this, Japan has announced its revised 2030 reduction target last month at the Redesign. It is committed to reducing emissions by 46% from 2013 levels, but will strive for 50%. This new target is much more ambitious than the original target of 26%. As you can see, Japan, like other major governments, is planning to reduce emissions in a linear manner between now and 2050. However, the reality is that we need even more ambitious commitment to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And these commitments must also be backed by action. Japan has taken steps to green its COVID-19 recovery package. More than 90% of its energy-related stimulus fundings, more than $19 billion is allocated to supporting clean energy. Most of this clean energy funding is allocated to supporting technological developments for decarbonization, but the country also focuses on increasing the share of renewable through projects with next-generation solar cells, offshore wind, and green hydrogen. In addition to technological innovations, Japan is implementing social and lifestyle innovations, focuses on green jobs and new work styles. Investment in climate should also be coupled with investment in the conservation of nature and ecosystem services. Forests and peatlands are important carbon sinks. Peatlands are carbon-rich ecosystems that cover just 3% of the Earth's land surface, but store a third of the world's soil carbon. The emissions from the destruction of natural forests and peatlands is a significant portion of the global total. Without addressing this issue, it will be difficult for developed countries' national emissions commitments to be sufficiently impactful. Tropical rainforests and peatlands are being destroyed and converted to agricultural land. Especially harmful is the destruction of tropical peat swamps, causing enormous amounts of greenhouse gases to be released. Conserving these forests and peatlands is critically important for climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation. To address these issues, investment in technology, transfer, and capacity building for nature-based climate solutions are critical. Such investment enables us to mitigate emissions, protect the biodiversity of forests and peatlands, and ultimately improve the well-being of local communities by restoring the ecosystem services that they depend on. Better still, international cooperation itself can also be redesigned. Traditional approaches simply involved developed countries providing developing countries with aid and/or technical assistance. This approach limits how recipient countries can participate in the process. Instead, countries can take a co-innovation approach in which countries traditionally on the giving end and those on the receiving end can co-design, co-produce, and scale solutions together. In terms of technology transfer, co-innovation allows technologies to be scaled better so that they not only have a greater impact, but also benefit even more people by stimulating local economies and markets. This new approach to international cooperation will pave the way for further accelerating the transformative development that we need. As the world faces multifaceted crises, redesigning our societies for sustainability and resilience is all the more important. In the COVID era, global collective action across national boundaries, across disciplines, and across levels of governance is necessary to build back better. We are already seeing forward-thinking investment, but our efforts can be further accelerated. Let's work together to invest in the future we want. Thank you very much.
All right, and our thanks to Mr. Takeuchi for that message. Again, the sense of urgency and more action needed is being presented to us, and also presenting to us how Japan is really redesigning its society for the future, a greener future. All right, thank you for that, Mr. Takeuchi. Our next guest is Frank Riesberman. He is also an IFF board member and Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. Frank also has a video message for us, so if we could.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at the IFF spring meeting during a time when the COVID-19 pandemic is still causing huge challenges for many countries, both the pandemic as a public health crisis and the economic crisis as a result of it. Many of the Global Green Growth Institute's member countries are either still under lockdown or are experiencing very serious challenges. Of course, governments have made a huge effort to find funds for a stimulus, more than $15 trillion to date. But according to the assessment of many observers, only a small share of that funding has been used for green investments. That's a missed opportunity, because in fact, green investments do provide green jobs. According to our assessments and that of many others, the green jobs generated through investments in renewable energy and in energy efficiency are 2 to 5 times as high as those in conventional fossil fuel alternatives. So investing in green can indeed be combined for recovery and for accelerating climate action. We're very pleased that even during the pandemic, so many governments have made pledges to move their economy to net zero, most of them by 2050. That, of course, will require very strong action to be achieved. The first important milestone is the end of the year in Glasgow, and we are very pleased that even during the pandemic, so many governments submitted new NDC commitments to the UNFCCC, and that critical blocks of countries and large countries have made commitments of around 50% of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which will be compatible with net zero by 2050. The European Union, the US recently, Japan, have all made commitments of 45 to 50%. Now indeed there are a few important countries remaining. We are hosted by the Republic of Korea, and President Moon has committed to come up with a new higher ambition NDC later this year, which we hope to be along the same lines, going for 50% by 2030. Once governments have made such commitments, the focus will shift to the private sector. Many companies have made commitments to reduce their emissions to zero, or to join the RE100 initiative, to have 100% of their energy produced from renewable energy. And we were very pleased to see the landmark report from the International Energy Agency earlier this week that demonstrated that the world still has an opportunity to have a rapid transition in the energy sector, and that net zero by 2050 is possible, and that the world does not need any more investments in fossil fuels, particularly coal. Powering past coal, moving out of coal, is becoming a critical priority, and particularly important for Asia, which is still dependent for a very large share of its energy mix on coal. The government of Korea has recently made a commitment to stop the funding of new coal-fired power plants internationally. That is important because, together with China, Korea was one of the major investors in such projects. We hope we'll see a similar commitment from China, and that indeed the Belt and Road Initiative will be a pathway to share the clean and green technology that China is developing and using domestically so effectively. In addition to deploying more renewable energy, we'll need to see a lot more focus on energy efficiency. Energy efficiency in buildings is a large opportunity that does not depend on developing new technology, and that we believe can be expanded very much. Together with, of course, the expanded use of electricity in more sectors wherever possible, but recognizing that electrification is not possible everywhere. To that extent, we are optimistic that in those sectors that are hard to decarbonize, green hydrogen can play an important role. A number of countries have invested in the research of green hydrogen solutions, and these appear to be very close to coming to market. That is important for countries like Korea, that currently are importing a very large amount of natural gas. And if it is possible to replace the import of natural gas with the import of green hydrogen that could be produced in countries that have potential for hydropower,
particularly if that can be run-of-river hydropower. Countries that are GGI members, such as Laos, PDR, or Indonesia, see a lot of opportunity to produce run-of-river hydropower, transfer that into green hydrogen, and then bring that to Korea, for example, for use in industry, for use in transportation. Together, I believe that that offers excellent opportunities to move to net zero, but we cannot forget that there is already a major effect of climate change even as we speak, and that we do also need to adapt to climate change. Climate-smart agriculture, therefore, and nature-based solutions, particularly reforestation or rehabilitation of degraded areas, particularly mangroves and peatlands, are a very important area of focus. And China, which has invented the small pump, the small 1 to 5 horsepower pump that has revolutionized groundwater irrigation, but also led to a massive use of fossil fuel in agriculture, now I think has an excellent opportunity to further develop and spread the use of solar pumps in irrigation, which at the same time will be an excellent way to increase the resilience of agriculture to climate change. That brings me to my final point. We do need international solidarity. Countries that contributed least to the climate problem in Africa, the least developed countries, the small island development states, they rely on climate finance, and they have a right to expect that the international development assistance will be increasingly green. We're hoping that indeed the Belt and Road Initiative will see more greening, that there will be an end of support for fossil fuel projects as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and that it will be an effective pathway to share green technology and experience on renewable energy, on electric mobility, and on a range of other clean and green technologies that have been developed and used so effectively in China. I thank you for your attention.
Okay, many thanks for that, Frank Ries-Behrman, Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. And another good reminder for us that investing in green technologies, investment in green does not have to be mutually exclusive with stimulating economic development and economic growth overall. All right, our next guest is Ahmed Saeed, Vice President of the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Saeed also has a video message for us. Let's listen in.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the International Finance Forum for the invitation to the Asian Development Bank to join this session on green recovery of the global economy in the post-pandemic era. As we all know very well, we're currently in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic. One thing that I would note about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it was in fact a crisis foretold. Many experts had warned us about the risks of a global pandemic of this nature. Climate change is also a crisis foretold. And so these two are in a sense related. The COVID-19 pandemic is a reminder that what is predicted often comes to pass. Many of our countries did not adequately prepare for COVID-19. And one question we must ask ourselves is, do we want to repeat that mistake, this time on a planetary scale? And of course the answer is that we do not, and it behooves all of us to pay great attention to the importance of green recovery of the global economy in the post-pandemic era. Now this pandemic has also changed the calculus from what preceded it. Governments are far more stretched, with fiscal space more limited. The poorest are poorer and more vulnerable. And it is taking time for countries to recover, providing a weaker base from which to build a green future. And the pandemic has also made the path to green more difficult, while also making it more important and more tangible. But one thing is clear for all of us. There is no path forward but the green and resilient path. And we must work together to promote a resilient, equitable, fair, and green recovery. Another lesson of the COVID-19 pandemic is that global problems require global solutions. And of course, global solutions require international cooperation. We can see very well in the case of the pandemic, and hopefully learn the lesson for green recovery, that unilateral action has its limits. At the end of the day, it will always be suboptimal, and we will always either win or lose together. And as we move forward towards a post-COVID-19 era and implementing the Paris Agreement, it's very important for us to enhance international cooperation to fight climate change. In fact, it's not unfair to say that this is our most important collective priority. In this vein, ADB has stepped up its own efforts, both within our organization, within our control, as well as in collaboration with others, to help limit climate change and its impacts. As an organization, we act in a number of different ways. We act for our own account. We act as an institutional coordinator and driver of international cooperation. We participate in and sponsor regional platforms for cooperation. And we also engage in various forms of innovation to find new structures and solutions to climate problems. Let me begin first by describing how ADB plans to act on its own account, which we intend to do in a very substantial way. By 2030, 75% of the total number of ADB's operations will support climate action. And climate finance from ADB's own resources will reach $80 billion cumulatively from 2019 to 2030. So we have very substantial and very important internal targets. But as I mentioned, this is an area where international cooperation and coordination are absolutely essential. And so this is a second important and significant area of ADB engagement. How are we doing this? Well, first, ADB is committed to aligning its operations with the Paris Agreement. In collaboration with other development banks, we're developing a framework to guide operations to be consistent with the national low emissions development pathways and to be compatible with the Paris Agreement. This effort will also work towards increasing the capacity of our clients to adapt to climate change and screen operations for climate resilience, to accelerate such transitions through climate finance, and to support clients to develop long-term strategies, including in monitoring and reporting on Paris Agreement-related activities. ADB also established a climate risk management framework as long ago as 2014. This framework mandates that all projects be screened for climate risks, and that factors such as climate adaptation considerations be brought into climate and project design. ADB also now integrates climate resilience considerations in every country partnership strategy. A second way we're focused on institutional coordination and cooperation is that we work with our member countries, especially on helping them meet their nationally determined contribution, or NDC, requirements under the Paris Agreement. For example, ADB established NDC Advance, a dedicated support facility to help our member countries translate their NDCs into specific climate investment plans. NDC Advance is currently supporting 8 countries, including Armenia, Georgia, Indonesia, Marshall Islands, Mongolia, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, and we are having discussions about additional support with other countries. In Mongolia, for example, NDC Advance is providing support to develop sector action plans for the energy and agricultural sectors as inputs to the country's NDC implementation roadmap, as well as defining the climate finance landscape. Yet another area of coordination and cooperation is our membership in the NDC partnership. Members of this global partnership leverage their resources and expertise to provide countries with the tools they need to implement their NDCs and combat climate change in order to build a better future. Development partner coordination is always a critical priority, but never so critical and important as it is in order to help build a green future. A third area I wanted to mention of ADB engagement, in addition to our activities for our own account and institutional coordination and cooperation, is our work on regional platforms for cooperation. I'll provide just one small example, although this is a very robust area of activity for the Asian Development Bank. We have a $300 million effort on regional green recovery post-COVID-19 that we launched in 2021 for ASEAN. This effort is focused on integrating the value chain of activities with $300 million of support from the Green Climate Fund and aims to catalyze $4 billion of green infrastructure projects. And then a fourth area that I wanted to mention is that we work to foster innovative solutions for difficult problems. An example of such a problem is the challenge of dealing with long-life industrial assets with large carbon footprints. For example, coal-fired power plants or industrial plants that are expected to survive and be viable economically and commercially for another 40 or 50 years. These are the source of incredibly large amounts of CO2 emissions. ADB is working on blended finance solutions that could provide equitable, scalable, and market-based mechanisms, leveraging the capital markets and financial markets in order to accelerate the phase-out of such assets, including coal-fired power, in many of our countries. Let me also say something about money. The resources required for recovering from the pandemic and progressing on a low-carbon pathway to meet the Paris Agreement targets are incalculably large. No actor, including the ADB, has funds required for this purpose. And therefore, it's important that we play a catalytical role, that we leverage our convening authority and our legitimacy, the trust that we have with governments and other actors, in order to mobilize others who are like-minded and have common purpose, so that we can help foster and create ecosystems that benefit from the most relevant and best expertise, insights, innovation, and capital. Let me highlight, for example, our work with the PRC, the host country of this forum, on climate change. ADB is working with the PRC to help the national targets of peaking carbon emission before 2030 in order to pave the way towards carbon neutrality before 2060. In order to do this, we will leverage all of our toolkit, green finance, sovereign, non-sovereign cooperation, and other tools. We're especially focused on projects that leverage emerging and advanced technologies, including carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen. And we will also expand our existing focus on climate-resilient and nature-based solutions for integrated water and natural resource management. Let me reiterate that ADB will continue to play the major role that it has historically as a development financier, a knowledge bank, and as an innovative solution provider. And we will hold firm to our ambitious climate targets. We will continue to help developing countries achieve and even increase their Paris Agreement commitments while charting a path towards a fair and equitable future with net zero emissions through various programs focusing on NDCs, carbon markets, and the development of sound and ambitious long-term national strategies. Let me conclude on one final point. One thing is crystal clear. This is not the time for business as usual. History may look at COVID-19 as the great warning, the crisis that foretold another one, potentially just around the corner. And we do not know today whether history will mark us as a prudent generation, one that took the warning and acted on it, or as a historically imprudent one. The choice is ours to make. At the Asian Development Bank, we are trying to do our part and more through ambitious climate targets for our own account, by being active in the international coordination and cooperation arena, by being a sponsor of and collaborator with regional platforms for cooperation, and by fostering innovative solutions. We will, of course, keep looking to do more for the opportunity to share some time with you today. Thank you so much, and I wish you a wonderful event.
Great. Thank you for that very stark message, Ahmed Saeed, Vice President of the Asian Development Bank. And our next guest is Mr. Liu Yanhua, Director of the Expert Committee at China's National Climate Change Committee. 刘部长，欢迎。
I'd like to thank the chair, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today, at this meeting, I want to share with you two observations. The first one is the implementation of the Paris Agreement globally would have to bridge the three gaps. And the second point is that we need to seize the opportunity of the green recovery. The first point is about the implementation of the Paris Agreement in 2015. In the COP, the Paris Agreement was passed, which is a signature achievement and a new milestone by all the countries, and it is the principle that has to be complied with by all the countries. After the Paris agreement being passed, we have already seen some progress. Nearly 200 countries and regions have approved or ratified the agreement, even though U.S. has temporarily withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. However, only after several months of their withdrawal being effective, they have come back to the Paris Agreement again, and many countries has already committed their own NDCs. And recently, there are some new updates on the NDCs. And specifically, many countries in the renewable energy sector, for example, in the new electronic cars and reforestation, there are many efforts in this regard. So a consensus reached globally have been seen to further enforce the Paris Agreement. However, from the overall implementation of the Paris Agreement, there are still three gaps. The first fact that the aggregate commitments wouldn't be able to sufficient contain the rise within the 2 degrees. According to an IDC research report, based on the current reduction of the carbon CO2, and then it is possible that until the end of this century, the temperature will rise by 3 degrees. And the second gap is that the current technology wouldn't be sufficient to support our current goal. So it is really a conflict, and this is the technological gap. And the last one is the capital gap. The capital that is in our hand wouldn't be able to sustain the actions that we want to take. So the first one is the commitment, and second one technological, and the last one is the funding or the capital gap. For the NDC commitment by all the countries based on the historical and the political differences, it is overly complex. For the developed countries, they have a historical accumulation of discharging of CO2. The developed countries accounts for only 15% of the population, accounting for 70% of the global GDP.
Per capita CO2 emission also exceeded the world average. So developing countries are just entering into the industrialization process, and for many countries, they're not there yet. And for these countries, they're still developing their economy so as to lift the people out of poverty. That is the most urgent issue. Against the backdrop of global warming, developing countries cannot follow the same rule or the same path that was followed by developed countries. That's not possible. However, we still have to make sure that they have the right and space for economic development. Given that, to stick to the principles of Paris Agreement, common but differentiated principle, are important, and that should be the basis for evaluating NDCs. And we shouldn't accelerate the poverty issues or wealth gap issues because of climate change. And secondly, technological gap. Talking about technological gap, I want to mention the new climate change envoy from the US, who during the interview with the UK media station mentioned that by 2045 or 2050, about 50% of the technologies may be still not developed. I think that's reasonable, but still influenced by opinions of some Western experts. Mostly he was criticized in that you shouldn't depend on the future technologies. Existing technologies should be improved. To me, in terms of technology, we should be optimistic, but also be innovative in having global cooperation. Just one example. In 1990, PV power generation for every 1,000 kilowatt hour, the cost was $100, and then in 2000 that was reduced to 10, and then 2010 the cost was reduced to $1. Now the cost for PV is just several cents. So the cost is comparable with that of coal power generation, maybe even lower. That shows that technological improvement gives us hope, and new technological practices can be scaled up in different countries. But from another perspective, right now there are still many technologies being explored. For example, hydrogen, nuclear fission, and biomass energy, etc. We are still studying. And any technological breakthrough will help us moving one step forward in terms of emission reduction. So my conclusion is that we have to be optimistic while working hard. And thirdly, capital gap. Right now, in terms of how much money needed in the future, it is unknown. And how much money available is unknown. According to IRENA, by 2050, around the world, we need $110 trillion for energy transition, and this is a big number. But we don't know where can we get. Developed countries once committed to spend $100 billion for developing countries, but by far we haven't seen these commitments fulfilled. There has been a global fund around the world, but this is far from enough. I think that the money required for climate governance shouldn't only come from the existing money. Instead, we have to develop economy, and through improved efficiency and further economic development, we can have new sources of capital. So I have to emphasize that development is king. Green financing should be developed further. Green financing, green credit, carbon market definitely will be very vibrant in the future. In terms of climate cooperation, my conclusion is that no country, in terms of dealing with the climate change, which is a common threat to the whole world, can stand alone. Only when we cooperate can we survive. That's the first point. And secondly, about green recovery. Since 2019, we didn't expect the exact loss from COVID-19. So this is the kind of revenge from nature, because we have been producing, manufacturing unreasonably. In 2020, global economy had negative growth because of COVID-19. A lot of places became so quiet. By far, 3.5 million people have suffered from COVID-19, and even more worrisome, we have new variants, and also there has been new resurgence of the pandemic. Who knows when it will end? I think this is a wake-up call for different countries, in that we have to rethink about interpersonal relationship, rethink how we develop our economy, how we should balance economy and environment. This is what we consider as a green recovery. So because of, for example, vaccine manufacturing improvement, we see progress in terms of COVID-19 prevention and controlling, but it's not time yet for us to say we are already in the post-pandemic era, at least in some countries and regions. Even after COVID-19, the world will never return to before 2019. COVID-19 has become an event that accelerates the world transition. It accelerates digital transformation, low-carbon economic development, etc. And this is the green recovery. And throughout this process, green elements should be the drivers for sustained, healthy growth. And with that, the human society would be more resilient. In 2020, EU proposed the Green Recovery Plan. EU is planning to invest 1.6 trillion euro in transportation, renewable energy, and building in terms of green transition. And they believe that green recovery not only will help reduce emission, but also promote economic development and employment. And in January 2021, the new U.S. government also signed many policies about climate, including invest $2 trillion by 2035 for green infrastructure, green R&D, etc. So in terms of the attitude, the new government is so different compared with the previous one. While the Chinese government is in the process of Industrial 2.5, we are transitioning from quantitative development to qualitative development. Dealing with the climate change is something we have to do, and it is in line with China's context, and also it is in line with the overall direction of ecological civilization. Because of forceful measures, even the impact from COVID-19 on China is limited. Still, during the process, green manufacturing, green way of life has emerged. For example, online meeting, online education, telemedicine, e-commerce, automated manufacturing, etc. All these will accelerate green recovery. Low carbon process will pick up the speed. In the future, these new habits, new way of production after COVID-19 comes to an end will become a new normal. In 2020, China mentioned the new infrastructure plan. By 2025, China plans to invest 10 trillion RMB for green infrastructure construction, including 5G and charging poles and digital economic infrastructures and UHV transmission line, etc. In the next 5 years, our 14th five-year plan mentioned specifically that energy, industrial transition, and energy efficiency improvement, low-carbon R&D, and also institutional reform and carbon sink, etc., would be priorities, so that truly green recovery would be implemented. Well, in addition, we see some other countries like South Korea are coming up with the green recovery plans. To summarize about green recovery, I think that green recovery has become consensus. And the key is that we should have digital transformation and low carbon transformation. And green recovery will help reshape world economic system, market system, as well as the world economic pattern. That's my 2 points. Lastly, I want to summarize a little bit what I said. My message is that it is a long way ahead for us to collaborate, and green recovery after COVID-19 is a great opportunity for us. Thank you very much.
非常感谢刘部长。
Thank you, Mr. Liu.
Is Zhou Jian. He is the former Vice Minister at the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of China, as well as a member of the 12th CPPCC National Committee. 周部长，有请。
Thank you, moderator. And also, I want to thank the previous speakers. I also want to thank all of the audience. I probably am the last speaker for this session, so I want to be very concise and very brief. According to the arrangement by the Secretariat of the Forum, I want to share with you changes that are happening in 3 aspects. First of all, the whole world is moving. Secondly, green development. What's the overall tone when it comes to green development? And then innovation and transformation would be major drivers for our development in the future. About the first point, carbon neutrality is a global consensus, and it has attracted a lot of attention. Countries are taking measures in this regard. Mr. Liu mentioned before about this. We know that in the past 200 years, CO2 concentration has been on the rise. And 270 ppm, that's the pre-industrial level, and the 380, that's 150 years ago. And in 2017, 405 ppm. In 2019, 415 ppm. And this year, In an observatory, we did the measurement 421 ppm, that's the intraday peak. Correspondingly, the temperature difference in the Arctic and Antarctic area, and also glacier melting and worsening habitats, extreme weather conditions, etc., and also the frequency of those extreme weather conditions have been on the rise. These are issues. Flood, drought, hydrological hazards are happening more frequently. Let's just look back at several scenarios. From September 2019 to 2020, Australia suffered from unprecedented fire and lots of forest, and about 1 billion animals were affected. They lost their lives. And then in 2021, the unprecedented snowstorm hit Texas. About 5 million people suffered from outage. And then in 2020, also we had another issue affecting the whole world. About 360 million insects crossing villages, farmlands, etc. And in 2021, probably still happening now, in Brazil, the unprecedented flood. 14,000 people couldn't go back home. And in Wuhan, in China, and in Suzhou, in Shenzhe of Suzhou, had unprecedented cyclone and hailstorm, etc. I'm not going to list. I want to share with you these incidents because understanding these things, these scenarios, you have to pay attention to the word unprecedented. Once in 100 for CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is on the rise because of many different changes happening. Probably now we're at a critical turning point. But this is not just 1 year or several years. Obviously, the ecosystem has been compromised. The balance has been compromised. So it is threatening the survival and development of the mankind. Nobody can stand alone. The whole global village is under great threat.
So carbon neutrality has been increasingly recognized by the countries around the world. As we know that 54 countries has already reached its carbon peak, accounting for nearly 40% of the carbon CO2 emissions. And for those top 15 emitters, including US, Canada, Japan, Korea, France, UK has reached their carbon peak. Let me list several figures. The per capita GDP is 65,000, 48,000, 40,000, 46,000, 41,000, and 31,000. We're at a point of 11,000. So I would like to remind all of you to remember this figure. So this is a comparison of 11,000 to 65,000. In the climate change meeting, and 55 countries has committed their NDC and accounting for above 65% of the GHG, accounting for 70% of the economic scale has become a carbon neutrality member. Now, let me talk about carbon peak. Since we have such a very big group of countries being the carbon neutrality member, our president, Mr. Xi Jinping, has already declared that hopefully we can reach our carbon peak by 2030, and by 2060 we can reach carbon neutrality. Based on the instructions of the central government and the CPC, all the provinces and all the sectors have been accelerating the transformation and the energy transformation so as to enable our development model to be more balanced, to pay more attention to the quality development, to be highly efficient, so as to expedite our processes to a high quality and sustainable path. So this is the first element we want to stress. Because of the time limit, I wouldn't further elaborate. Second point, green development has increasingly becoming the backbone and the key tone for our social and economic and environmental ecological development. In order to reach 2030, 2060 target, we still need to be calm and prudent, objective, and holistic when taking approaches. We need to form a social consensus facing such a very severe scenario with very complex situations. We are facing daunting tasks ahead of us. 2019, our crude oil stood at a very high figure, and it is on an increase. In 2019, our per capita GDP is higher than our global average, even though for the 10 years before that, we have been making the per capita GDP emission is still on a very high level. And in 2020, per capita consumption and the energy consumption is still lower than that of the advanced country, for example, for the US. For America, per capita annual usage of the electricity is around 370, and for us it is considerably lower. However, we are still on a rising trend. This is a normal trend. We are also facing a series of issues. First of all, how can we have a comprehensive plan to make sure of the general objective of sustainable and stable development of the social and economic development, and to achieve 2030 and 2060 objective? And how can we have breakthroughs either in technological or in the pathways to resolve these issues? How can we carry out plans which are tailored to the Chinese characteristics, including the carbon trading, carbon market, and etc.? We know starting from the 1st of January, more than 2,200 steel companies has been listed into the quotas, including the information collection, the fair equitable allocation, and also above the trading system, which has a cross-provincial nature. Fourthly, how can we react to the constraints of the carbon trading, which will have an impact to the economic development, and the financial market and the capital market will have an influence to the daily life of the public. As you know, the carbon prices has been rising to $56 per ton. That is reported in 2021. May the 17th, and according to the latest figure, that the carbon price has been rising to $59. And last year, we have altogether 10 billion of the volume, and on an average, the carbon pricing is around $25. And the lowest is in Shenzhen, 6.4, and in Beijing, it is 47. So as you can see, 56 euros, 59 US dollars compared with 25 RMB. Definitely, since you are all from the financial field, in order to reach such a cost mechanism, such a system can be set up, and it will definitely have influence of the public to the financial and the capital market and our fiscal policies as well. We should also need to fully realize that in a certain period of time, the reduction of CO2 will have an influence to economic development, pricing, employment, and regional equal development. It will pose great challenges to the previously mentioned issues. We should also fully realize from a long-term perspective, in order to reach the 30-60 objective for our transformation of our development model, for the upgradation of the industrial structure, to have rooms for development, to improve our welfare, it will also create great opportunities for all the previously mentioned areas. So we should leverage this, and we can come out with customized solutions for each region and each sector. We need to focus on the priorities and taking a progressive approach in dealing with these issues. We shouldn't take a sweeping, simplified, campaign-based model in tackling these issues. The timelines, schedules will have to tailor to the reality. We shouldn't really hamper the economic, lower the overall efficiency, and also downgraded the living conditions of the public. This shouldn't be the thing that we are aiming at. So for the next 10 years, we should be focusing on the green development, and the green concept should be further enshrined and implemented. We can further boost and accelerate the green recovery. So I would like to stress on the following 5 points because of the time limit. I've been taking enough time. First of all, trying to promote a whole cycle of the energy usage. First of all, accelerating the green energy as well as energy storage and its integration with the smart grid. I'm talking about hydrogen, green hydrogen, new nuclear, including PV, thermal, geothermal, hydrogen, and etc. Because coal-powered is per unit 220, and for PV it is 5 grams, and for wind it is 12. So making a comparison, the clean energy added by the smart grid, including super high pressure smart grid, so it can be fully integrated. I believe it is our direction for us to develop to a clean and green model. And secondly, we need to save energy and develop a path of energy efficiency and low carbon. I can tell our friends here as an audience, it can be predicted in the next 10 years, the PV development will enter a fast track. and hydrogen and nuclear energy will be more commercialized and more breakthroughs can be achieved in this regard. Storage technology and the energy transmission technology can have more breakthroughs. Digitalization and intelligence of such technologies can enter a golden age. I hope that you can pay more attention to such above-mentioned areas. And secondly, we hope that we can promote green logistics, green agriculture, green transport, so as to boost the development of the strategic new industry. Thirdly, we can intensify our technologies in the carbon capture, carbon sequestration technologies. Fourthly, we need to plan the green map, including covering the rivers, lakes, basins, and etc. For example, the rehabilitation of the grasslands and also the protection and the restoration of the ecological system. And another plan is about the restoration of the national land. If these plans can be coordinated together, it can expand our protection on the wetland, the grassland, and also other lands. The fifth one is the further advocacy of raising the awareness of the public of greenness. And the utilization of the green technology and low carbon technology should be gradually disseminated to the mass public. Incentive policies should be granted to those who observe the green policies, so such a saving society and the circular low carbon economy can be set up with Chinese characteristics. Thirdly, innovation and reforms would become the major driver to achieve the 2030 goal. In order to reach the 30-60 goal, we would have to embark on economic and social transformation which has a long-lasting impact. In such an era of tremendous changes, we need to focus on the harmonization and the innovation of the institutional structure and the policies, so that the governments would be able to do a better job in the social governance, which will have impact not only globally, domestically, but also globally. We should also fully leverage the advantages of our national system. We believe currently and also in the near future, development is still the key. It is the prerequisite of resolving all the issues, complying with whatever is the global trend. We need to be driven by innovation and reform.
First of all, we have to transform and reform our economic system, etc., so as to be adjusted to the new social environment. And secondly, we should come up with a legal framework and environment so as to come up with climate change-related laws and regulations. And thirdly, we have to transform the way our governments run and operate so as to come with a central coordination mechanism in this regard. We're so happy to see on the 26th of May, there was a very high-level working group about the 2 carbon-related targets established, so that this working group will coordinate among different departments and regions, etc., in dealing with these climate-related issues. Also, to promote public governance, social credit system to be established is also important. And fourthly, we have to never forget China's contest in thinking and constructing industries, agriculture, transportation, building, urbanization, and relevant infrastructures, we should be resilient in the context of climate change, and we have to prevent systematic climate risks and avoid or minimize climate disasters and its damages. Please pay attention. Climate resilient agriculture, transportation, building, and urban development. And fifthly, science and technology and innovation should be the drivers for us. And climate change expert committee as a think tank should be utilized. And Mr. Liu is a member of the committee. We have to set up a team where scientists from different sectors will be part of the members. And then sixth, green financing system and relevant rules should be drafted, including standards, auditing standards, accounting standards, insurance, loan, credit, financing, bond, etc. So that we can expand and also solidify the constraining systems. And seventh, we have to develop a green service industry, including consulting, designing, low carbon, housekeeping, daycare, third-party management service, etc. We believe that in this area, in China, service industry will account for higher and higher percentage and contributing more to the overall economic development. Overall speaking, while achieving the 2030 and 2060 targets throughout the process, we have to constantly focus on inclusiveness and also the basic nature. If we're talking about the welfare-related projects, we have to transform the economic development in making those indicators more balanced and indicative. We have to improve balanced provision of public good and also to improve the sense of happiness among the general public. I really hope that you can pay close attention to these elements, coordinated, balanced indicators. And the basic public goods should be provided in an equal way and inclusive basic public welfare elements, etc. While achieving the 2030 and 2060 targets, we should never forget these above-mentioned points. We need to improve these indicators, improve people's sense of happiness, so as to constantly improve the socialism mechanism and the advantages of such mechanism, and also utilize its functions. That's it from me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Comprehensive action plan and blueprint from China in terms of achieving a greener future in this country. 那么观众朋友们，我们时间有限，所以
Because our time is very limited, so just one simple question, and that is.
刘部长给您的问题。In my final. China has a very ambitious climate target, right? We all know wants to reach carbon neutrality by the year 2060, carbon peak by 2030. And China is doing this in a shorter amount of time, right? Shorter amount of time. China is achieving peak to neutrality in a span of around 30 years. Whereas for more advanced economies, they had 40, 50, 70 years to go from peak to neutrality. So given the scale of China's ambitious green agenda, how will that contribute to more international cooperation when it comes to climate change?
Thank you, moderator, for this question. How China plans to have international cooperation. Well, I'm just sharing from my perspective. This is a very important topic. In my speech, I mentioned that for us to address climate-related issues, no country can do it alone. We have to have international cooperation. But from which areas and aspects? To me, there are three. First of all, technological cooperation. Low-carbon technologies are so important for human progress, but this is a new milestone in human history. At first, we use wood, and then coal, and then natural gas and oil. Every time when we have new energy, the price is cheap, but the efficiency is improved, etc. That becomes drivers for economic development. So next step is about renewable energy, low carbon energy. In terms of the direction, the cost would be lower, but the efficiency would be higher, becoming new drivers for economic development. And the next step in international cooperation, low carbon technologies should be one area. I mentioned before, there are existing technologies and technologies to be developed. These technologies are where we get our competitiveness from, but also these technologies would be drivers for the new economic development. I have to say that for certain technologies, relatively speaking, they are quite, closed-door use in terms of patent, IP, but some other technologies can be widely used. So one thing to be considered, for those technologies that can be shared throughout the world, can be scaled up in different countries, we have to do that. And that's a very important step for the human society. And another thing, our colleague from Japan, Mr. Takeuchi, mentioned something important, which is about international technological cooperation. Sharing knowledge and technological cooperation is something that I fully agree with. We should have a comprehensive, multilateral cooperation. There are so many entrepreneurs with us. You have a lot of network. Through your network, your resources, probably you can share technologies for win-win results. That's for number one, in terms of collaboration. Secondly, experience. The world is so diverse. Different countries are levels of low carbon. Some countries have legislative experiences, or other countries have good measures, technological approaches in terms of their experiences. So we have to learn from each other. Well, these experiences, exchanges will enrich our knowledge and also help us to implement. In that way, in different areas, countries can move forward. That's about experience sharing. And thirdly, in terms of international cooperation, is about regional cooperation. The world is so big, it's not possible for the whole world to work on one thing at a time. The world is very diverse, and different regions are different, and different countries are different in terms of their political and economic background. So having regional cooperation is important. For China, to promote Green Belt and Road is one priority for us right now. At this moment, in terms of renewable energy, China is the biggest producer. Renewable energy technologies, many of them are quite mature right now. So we can transfer these technologies to the Belt and Road countries. So Belt and Road Initiative could truly be green. That's another direction. And in some other regions, they do have their own areas for cooperation. To summarize, technological cooperation, experience sharing, and also regional cooperation. These are three keys. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Liu.
Optimistic note, so thank you everyone for your patience in joining us in this session. We're going to end it here. And just a friendly reminder, okay, yes, we have these national and international policies on climate change, but ultimately, if we want to lower our carbon footprint, it also begins with ourselves as well, right? The individual itself. We also have a very important role to play in tackling our collective climate change targets. All right, thank you everyone. 谢谢大家。